Do you ever wonder if the life you built is really yours? Marcus asked himself quietly, staring out the window as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in muted oranges and pinks. The question had lingered in his mind for months, but tonight, with his wife Janine packing for her latest business trip, it echoed louder than ever. Marcus, a 42-year-old history professor, had once been deeply in love with Janine. Their whirlwind romance and blended family seemed like the perfect story. But over the years, the story had lost its spark. Their conversations had turned transactional, their intimacy infrequent. And now, as she zipped her suitcase shut, the silence between them was deafening. "Don't forget to water the plants," Janine said, her voice brisk as she double-checked her phone for her flight details. "I won't," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. He glanced at her, searching for some trace of warmth, but her focus was elsewhere. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Entering the room was Jalen, Janine's son from her previous marriage. At 22, Jalen had an effortless confidence that Marcus couldn't help but admire and envy. His deep brown skin, sharp jawline, and athletic build made him magnetic, but it was his easy smile and sharp wit that set him apart. "Need help with that, Mom?" Jalen asked, nodding at the suitcase. "I'm fine, thanks," Janine replied, barely looking up. Jalen turned to Marcus. "Guess it's just us guys holding down the fort, huh?" There was something about the way he said it, light-hearted but deliberate, that made Marcus pause. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, looks like it." Later that evening, after Janine had left for the airport, the house felt unervingly quiet. Marcus poured himself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the room. He wasn't expecting Jalen to join him, but soon enough, the younger man appeared, carrying a bowl of popcorn. "Mind if I join?" Jalen asked. Marcus gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Be my guest." They watched in silence for a while, the occasional crunch of popcorn breaking the stillness. Marcus couldn't focus on the movie. His thoughts kept drifting to Jalen. There was an unspoken energy between them, one Marcus didn't dare name. "You seem distracted," Jalen said, breaking the silence. Marcus hesitated, just thinking about work. End of semester chaos. Jalen smirked. "You sure? You've got that faraway look, like you're searching for something." Marcus laughed nervously. "And you've got a way of reading people that's almost unsettling." Jalen shrugged. "It's a gift. Or a curse, depending on who you ask." Over the next few days, the dynamic between them shifted in subtle but significant ways. They cooked dinner together, shared stories, and debated over music and movies. Jalen had a way of making Marcus feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as they stood side by side in the kitchen washing dishes, their conversation took a more personal turn. "You ever regret things?" Jalen asked, his tone unusually serious. Marcus looked at him, puzzled. "Regret what?" "I don't know. Choices. Paths not taken." Marcus felt a pang in his chest. "All the time," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. Jalen nodded, his gaze lingering on Marcus for a moment longer than necessary. "Yeah, me too." By the time Janine called to check in, Marcus found himself wishing her trip would last longer. It wasn't just the freedom of having the house to himself. It was a connection he was building with Jalen, a connection that felt deeper and more genuine than anything he'd experienced in years. "You too surviving without me." Janine's voice crackled through the speaker. "More than surviving," Marcus replied, glancing at Jalen, who was lounging on the couch. "Good. I'll be back late Sunday, so don't forget to pick me up from the airport." "Of course," Marcus said, but his thoughts were elsewhere. That night, Marcus sat alone in his study, staring at the blank page of his journal. The question from earlier replayed in his mind. Do you ever wonder if the life you build is really yours? He closed the journal without writing a single word. From the doorway, Jalen's voice broke the silence. You okay? Marcus turned to see him leaning casually against the frame, a faint smile on his lips. Yeah, Marcus lied, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Jalen or himself. Something in Jalen's eyes suggested he didn't believe him. Good night, Marcus, Jalen said, his tone gentle but charged with something unspoken. Good night, Marcus replied, his voice barely audible. As Jalen walked away, Marcus felt the pull of something he couldn't yet name. And for the first time in years, the life he had built felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within Marcus. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled in the distance, but the house was warm and still. He stood at the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. You seem tense. Jalen's voice came from behind him, low and calm. Marcus turned, startled, to see Jalen leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his eyes piercing through the dim light. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, yet somehow he exuded a quiet power that made the air between them feel heavier. I'm fine, Marcus replied, his voice betraying him with its unsteady tone. Jalen smirked, stepping closer. You've said that a lot lately. I'm not sure I believe you. Marcus wanted to say something, anything, to deflect, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched as Jalen moved closer, the space between them shrinking to nothing. Marcus, Jalen said softly, his voice carrying a gravity that Marcus couldn't ignore. Why do you keep running from what you feel? I'm not, Marcus began, but Jalen interrupted him. You are. Jalen's hand rested lightly on Marcus's arm, sending a jolt through him. You don't have to, you know. Not with me. The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Later, they found themselves on the couch, the room illuminated by the soft glow of a forgotten movie playing on the TV. Marcus sat rigidly at one end, Jalen at the other, the space between them both a comfort and a challenge. Do you ever think about what you really want? Jalen asked, his tone casual but his eyes searching. Marcus hesitated, his pulse quickening. I don't know if I've let myself think about it. Jalen shifted closer, his movements slow, deliberate. Maybe it's time you did. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The thunder, the rain, the constraints of morality and loyalty, all of it faded into the background. Jalen reached out, brushing his fingertips against Marcus's hand, a touch so light it was almost imperceptible. Marcus didn't pull away. The kiss was inevitable. It began tentatively, both men unsure, testing the boundaries of the moment. But as soon as their lips met, the hesitation dissolved, replaced by a raw and undeniable need. Marcus felt his resolve crumble. The walls he had built over years of suppressing his desires, collapsing under the weight of this connection. Jalen's hands were firm yet gentle, guiding Marcus as if he had known him forever. The heat between them was electric, their breaths mingling as they moved closer, bodies pressing together in a way that felt both forbidden and utterly right. Marcus pulled back briefly, his chest heaving. This can't happen, he whispered, though his hands betrayed him by staying firmly on Jalen's shoulders. Why not? Jalen's voice was steady, his eyes locked onto Marcus's. Because it's wrong? Or because it's exactly what you want and that scares you? Marcus had no answer. The night unfolded like a dream Marcus didn't want to end. They didn't speak much, their actions saying everything words couldn't. Jalen's touch was both grounding and freeing, his presence a balm to wounds Marcus hadn't even realized he carried. When it was over, they lay in silence, the sound of the rain filling the room. Marcus stared at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of guilt, desire, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. Jalen propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at Marcus. "You okay?" Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "I don't know what happens now." Jalen smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from Marcus's forehead. "We figured out. Together." The simplicity of the statement both comforted and terrified Marcus. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Marcus slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jalen. He stood by the window, watching the rain-soaked world outside. His mind raced with questions he couldn't yet face. What would Janine say if she knew? What did this mean for his marriage, his identity, his future? Behind him, Jalen stirred, his voice groggy but warm. "You don't have to overthink this, Marcus." Marcus turned, his eyes meeting Jalen's. "How can I not?" Jalen sat up, the sheets pooling around his waist. "Because sometimes, what feels right is worth the risk." The words hit Marcus like a tidal wave. He wanted to believe them, wanted to surrender to the possibility that this connection could be something more than a fleeting moment. But the weight of his choices loomed over him, an ever-present shadow. "Come back to bed," Jalen said, his tone gentle but insistent. Marcus hesitated, the pull of responsibility warring with the pull of desire. Finally, he sighed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Okay," he said, the word carrying both resignation and hope. As he returned to Jalen's side, the storm outside began to wane, leaving behind a quiet that felt both fragile and full of promise. Marcus stood in the kitchen the next morning, staring at the steam rising from his coffee. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside glistening with a deceptive calm. Inside, his thoughts churned like storm waters, the weight of the previous night pressing on him. Jalen entered the room quietly, his presence commanding even in silence. He was wearing the same clothes from the night before, and though his expression was neutral, his eyes carried a knowing softness. "Morning," Jalen said, his voice steady. "Morning," Marcus replied, his grip tightening on the mug. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken words between them filled the space, heavy and electric. Finally, Jalen leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "Are you regretting it?" he asked, his tone gentle but direct. Marcus hesitated, the question slicing through him. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's complicated." Jalen nodded, as if he had expected the answer. "It doesn't have to be." Marcus looked at him sharply. "How can you say that? I'm married. Your mother." He stopped, the guilt rising like bile in his throat. "And is she happy? Are you?" Jalen's words were calm, but they hit their mark. When Janine returned later that day, the house felt different. Marcus greeted her at the door, his usual composure strained as he helped her with her luggage. "How was your trip?" he asked, forcing a smile. "Exhausting," Janine replied, brushing past him. She glanced around the house. "Everything looks intact. Guess you two managed just fine without me." Marcus swallowed hard. "Yeah, everything was fine." Jalen appeared from the living room, his demeanor as casual as ever. "Hey, Mom. Welcome back." Janine smiled at him, though it lacked warmth. "Thanks, Jalen." She turned to Marcus. "I need a shower. Can you start dinner?" "Of course," Marcus said, relieved for the reprieve. As Janine disappeared upstairs, Marcus felt Jalen's gaze on him. He turned, meeting those dark, penetrating eyes, and felt his pulse quicken. Jalen didn't say anything, but the faint tilt of his head, the almost imperceptible smirk, spoke volumes. Dinner was a strained affair. Janine was preoccupied with her emails, barely glancing up as Marcus and Jalen exchanged polite conversation. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. "So," Janine said suddenly, breaking the monotony. "What did you two do while I was gone?" "Not much," Jalen replied smoothly. "Caught up on some shows, cooked a little. Nothing too exciting." Marcus nodded, his throat dry. "Pretty uneventful, really." Janine narrowed her eyes slightly, but didn't press further. "Well, I'm glad things stayed calm. I've had enough chaos for 1 week." Later that night, Marcus found himself in his study, staring at the blank page of his journal once again. The pen in his hand felt heavy, his thoughts too tangled to unravel. He hadn't heard Jalen enter, but he wasn't surprised when he felt the younger man's presence behind him. "You keep staring at that page like it owes you something," Jalen said, his voice low. Marcus sighed, setting the pen down. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," Jalen replied, moving closer. "You're the one making it complicated." Marcus turned to face him, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What do you expect me to do, Jalen? Just forget everything else?" "I expect you to be honest with yourself," Jalen said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You've been living a lie for so long. You don't even recognize the truth when it's staring you in the face." The word struck a nerve. Marcus looked away, his jaw tightening. "You deserve to be happy," Jalen continued, his voice softening. "And so does she. Pretending doesn't help anyone." The next morning, Marcus stood at the window, watching the sunrise. The world outside seemed impossibly bright, as if mocking the storm within him. Janine entered the room, her expression guarded. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus turned to her, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Janine asked, her eyes narrowing. Marcus's chest tightened. The words were there, clawing to be released, but he couldn't bring himself to say them. "No," he said finally, the lie bitter on his tongue. "Everything's fine." Janine studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right." She turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Jalen found him later in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. "You didn't tell her," Jalen said, more a statement than a question. Marcus shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I couldn't." Jalen stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then what now?" Marcus looked up, his gaze meeting Jalen's. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile, faint but genuine. "One step at a time," he said. Jalen nodded, his expression softening. "I can live with that." As they stood there, the morning light streaming in, Marcus felt a tentative sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was willing to face it. Together,